Beautiful. Thank you. May I, may you, may we be a bridge over the troubled water to come. Because this week, our country elected Donald Trump for a second term as President of the United States. A 78-year-old convicted felon. A man who self-evidently, at least to me, is a fraud, a sexual abuser, a snake oil salesman, a carnival barker, an insult comic, wholly unfit for the highest office in the land. Nevertheless, he is on track to win not only the Electoral College, but also likely the popular vote. There is so much to say. This sermon is simply my first rough draft of trying to respond in the midst of a devastating week in which we are all still reeling, very much including myself. But I do think it is vital to at least begin to try to wrestle honestly and directly with this election. Although all the data isn't out yet and there will be much more to say in the future, it's looking like at least 91% of counties nationwide shifted rightward toward Trump compared to the 2020 election. 91%. Trump won 46% of the Latino vote, the highest number a Republican presidential candidate has won in the last 50 years. He won women by 8 points, and that would be the Democrats' smallest margin since 2004. That's all hard news, so let me highlight a few examples of the ways that our country hasn't completely lost its mind. Democrat Josh Stein won the North Carolina governor's race, defeating Republican Mark Robinson, who called himself proudly a black Nazi and made other offensive remarks publicly on a pornographic website. Apparently, there are some lines that are too far to cross, even as for most of us, Trump for years has been crossing more red lines than we can count. Delaware elected Sarah McBride to the U.S. House of Representatives as the first openly transgender member of Congress. That's one bit of good news in an election in which Republicans cynically exploited transphobia. Even though Trump won the state of Wisconsin, Democrat Tammy Baldwin, who is openly lesbian, still won re-election to a third term to the U.S. Senate from the state of Wisconsin, a very clutch victory for Baldwin. Angela Also Brooks will become this state's first black U.S. senator. In 7 states, Nevada, Arizona, Montana, Colorado, Missouri, New York, and right here in Maryland are projected to have passed measures protecting or expanding abortion rights and reproductive justice. In this election, by all means, misogyny and racism were a factor and rampantly at play, as is to blame our fractured and incredibly polarized media environment. But if I had to give one word answer to how Trump was reelected even after January 6th and all of the racism, sexism, transphobia, xenophobia, corruption, chaos, and more, that one word would be demagoguery. A vulnerability the ancient Greeks who invented democracy in the first place had been sounding the alarm about. They started sounding it 2,500 years ago. Trump is a demagogue. He's a politician who cynically plays on people's fears and emotions against the better angels of their nature. Regarding the specific vulnerability of the U.S. to demagoguery, I want to invite you to hear a passage written in 1998, almost 2 decades before Trump began a serious bid for the presidency. It's by my favorite philosopher, the late American pragmatist Richard Rorty, who died in 2007. This quote is from one of my all-time favorite books. It's titled Achieving Our Country, Leftist Thought in the 20th Century. It's both short and worth your time. He writes, this is again, in 1998, members of labor unions and unorganized, unskilled workers will sooner or later that the government is barely trying to prevent wages from shrinking or to prevent jobs from being exported. Around that same time, suburban white-collar workers, themselves desperately afraid of being downsized, are not going to let themselves be taxed to provide social benefits for anyone else. At this point, something will crack. The non-suburban electorate will decide that the system has failed and start looking for a strong man to vote for. A strong man is just another word for a demagogue. Someone willing to assure them that once he is elected, the smug bureaucrats, the tricky lawyers, the overpaid bond salesmen, the postmodernist professors, or he's calling himself out too, will no longer be calling the shots, and all the resentment which badly educated Americans feel about having their manners dictated to them by college graduates will find an outlet. In other words, to me, the failure to tax the richest among us, to close the wealth gap, to provide a stable living wage for all, as well as to provide easy, affordable access to college education for everyone who wants it. That creates the condition in which a con man like Trump can manipulate a sufficient number of the masses to win. Or at the risk of being blunt, James Carville has been saying since 1992, it's the economy, stupid. I'm sorry if that's too blunt. The antidote that makes people less susceptible to what our own UU tradition calls universalism. We need universal childcare, universal health care, universal education through college or vocational training, and I would add to that a universal basic income that is actually a living wage. Now, how do you pay for all that? You tax the rich. That's where the money is. Look with me at this chart, starting on the bottom right-hand corner. Studies show that the top 20% of the US population has 84% of its wealth. They have plenty to spare. But here's the real rub if you look above it. When you ask people in surveys, they think the top 20% have 36% of the wealth. People do not perceive the wealth gap accurately. Moving to the left, the pretty well-off quintile has only 11%, but that's only half of what people think. The middle quintile has 4% of wealth, only a fifth as much as most people think, which leaves, in truth, virtually nothing for the bottom two quintiles who should be sharpening their pitchforks and raging. It's way less than most people think. I suspect most of you listening to me already know the truth. Voting for Trump is only going to make inequality much worse. And we need political leaders, though, who are better able to raise our collective consciousness about the actual economic situation here in the US to, again, help us sharpen our pitchforks and unite us to demand a better future for all. Now, don't misunderstand me. I am not talking about centering white grievance. I'm talking about centering a diverse, multicultural coalition of working families. That can look like rallying people over taxing the exorbitantly wealthy. I'm talking about people, if you have over $10 million in wealth, I'm talking to you. Like that's what I'm talking about. Taxing people that are exorbitantly wealthy. Rallying people around fairness limits. What if executives in this country, in a company, could not make more in a month than the company's lowest wage worker makes in a year? Thus limiting the wage ratio to 12-1 instead of like 250-1, 300-1, 500-1. Seriously, it would be very fascinating if investment bankers and CEOs who earn 250 times the average wage of childcare workers took on childcare work for a few months and then see whether they still think that their jobs are 250 times more difficult or entail levels of responsibility that are 250 times greater. We need a very hard and very honest conversation that we did not have in this past election about what we mean by hard work and how to compensate a lot of people differently on both ends of the economic spectrum. I'm not saying everyone's equal. You can still get paid a lot more for harder work and still make $10 million in wealth. What we're talking about is way before you get to billionaires being a policy problem, we've got a problem way before then, and it creates the resentment that is exploited by demagogues. Relatedly, I want to invite you to hear just one paragraph from the statement that Senator Bernie Sanders released the day after the election. He said, today, the very rich are doing phenomenally well. 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. And we have more income and wealth inequality than ever before. Real inflation accounted for weekly wages for the average American worker are lower now than they were 50 years ago. And that impacts how people feel of like, are you better off or not? Do you have hope that your children will be better off or not? And when people don't feel that, they get angry and they vote for change. They vote against the incumbent, whoever that is. If you do live paycheck to paycheck, and I know that is the case for many people in this congregation, I suspect you already get this on a deep, visceral, existential level. If you don't live paycheck to paycheck, it's important to pause and just even more fully open yourselves, as I know some of you already have, even more fully open yourselves to the lived reality of 60% of our fellow citizens living paycheck to paycheck, and how housing prices and prices at the grocery store and the gas pump, they create the conditions that a demagogue like Trump can exploit and blame immigrants instead of blaming the wealthiest among us. Trump cynically fools people into thinking that he's on their side when he has only ever been on his own side. Our challenge is to authentically create a movement for change that is broad enough of a coalition of the electorate can connect to. Let me be also clear again that multiple things are true. There's so much work that remains to be done for racial justice, reproductive justice, trans rights, climate justice, so much more. This is a both and situation. And we need political leaders who are able to communicate in a compelling way that they are committed to day in and day out to wallet and pocketbook issues. Look, as someone who is raising a Black and Asian 16-month-old, I would have been so proud. I would have been overjoyed to welcome him into political consciousness in which our first Black and Asian person was president, our first female president. And I both lament and fear the reality of him learning that the current president is a figure as reprehensible, as symbolic of toxic masculinity, as is Donald Trump. Trump is the exact opposite of the man I hope to raise my son to become. And it's devastating. Along these lines, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about what influences do I want to form and influence Jalen in such a time as this. And relatedly, I want to invite you to hear a second quote from Rorty. This is from his autobiographical essay. This is going to be a little too extreme for some of you, but stick with me. Your mileage may vary. As I read it, I invite you to reflect on what are the parallel influences in your childhood. I think about, for me, I'm about to share Rorty, but I think about, for me, the soundtrack of my childhood in many ways was Rush Limbaugh. Yet I'm here because I, in some ways, through a confluence of circumstances combined with my own choices, opted into a different set of soundtracks for my life. So think about what are the books you were surrounded with? Who were the people, the films, all of that? This is what Rorty writes. When I was 12, the most salient books on my parents' shelves were 2 red-bound volumes, The Case of Leon Trotsky and Not Guilty. These made up the report of the Dewey Commission of Inquiry into the Moscow trials. Now, I never read them with the wide-eyed fascination I brought to books like Krafft Ebling's Psychopathia Sexualis, but I thought of these 2 red-bound volumes in the way of which other children came to think of their family's Bibles. They were the books that radiated redemptive truth and moral splendor. And if I were a really good boy, I would say to myself, I would have read not only the Dewey Commission reports, but also Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, a book I started many times, but I will confess to you, never managed to finish. For in the 1940s, the Russian Revolution and its betrayal by Stalin were for me what the incarnation and its betrayal by Catholics had been to precocious little Lutherans 400 years before. I grew up knowing that all decent people were, if not Trotskyites, at least socialists. And working as an unpaid office boy during my 12th winter, and I think this piece is really important, I carried with me press releases from the Workers' Defense League office. And as a 12-year-old boy on a subway, I would read those documents that my parents had asked me to carry. And they told me so much about what factory owners do to union organizers, what plantation owners did to sharecroppers, what the white locomotive union did to black firemen whose jobs those white men wanted, now that diesel engines were replacing coal-fired steam engines. So at 12, I knew, because of the forces that had formed me, that the point of being human is to spend your life fighting for social justice. So what story or stories were you told as a child? Even more importantly, what story or stories are you choosing to weave into your narrative now and for the future? One of the reasons that I show up here week after week is that I need to be part of this big tent congregation whose diversities challenge me in so many ways, the diversities we have and the diversities we seek to ever more fully include in the future. They challenge me to grow deeper and wider, more loving, more compassionate than I would otherwise. For now, I want to share just a few steps on where do we go from here. I want to invite you to hear some highlights. This is from an article called 10 Ways to Be Prepared and Grounded Now That Trump Has Won. It's from an organization called Waging Nonviolence. The whole article is worth reading in full. You can search for it. I'll post a link in the text of the sermon in our online archives. The first of the 10 ways is trust yourself. To quote from George Orwell's dystopian novel, 1984, the party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. What he's saying is the party gaslights you. It was their final, most essential command. And in the face of Trump's constant barrage of lies, disinformation, and misinformation, at the gut level, you still know right and wrong. Trust yourself in the days to come. And find others who you trust. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt traces the ways that fascist and autocratic regimes have always tried to exploit loneliness and increase social isolation. We need one another now more than ever, and as if you've heard me quote before, if you are feeling overwhelmed as one person in the face of all the problems in the world, stop being one person. Make intentional decisions to show up and be in community with like-minded people. Show up in beloved communities like this one so that we can form the resistance together. Show up here sometimes and in others' communities, even when you're not sure if you want to, because it's not just for yourself. Someone else may need for you to be here so that you can connect in unexpected, unforeseen, unplanned ways. Third, grieve. Give yourself permission to feel what you are feeling. As the saying goes, the only way out is through. Also, as you are able, get out into nature. It will help. Get out of your mind and into your body as you can. It will help you process. 4, release that which you cannot change. As the Serenity Prayer goes, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Trump specializes in distractions. Look for those places that you can actually leverage power and create change in the days ahead. 5, find your path. The full article, again, goes into a lot of detail about various options. The upshot is to look for how you feel uniquely able to invest your time and your energy in the days ahead in resisting and combating the worst impulses of the coming administration. 6, do not obey in advance. Do not self-censor. As Timothy Snyder has written in his excellent and short book titled On Tyranny, most of the power of authoritarianism is freely given. In times like these, individuals think ahead about what a more repressive government will want and then offer it themselves without even being asked. A citizen who adapts in this way is teaching power what it can do. Look for all the ways you can make a difference within your spheres of influence. 7, reorient your political map. Specifically, I think it's clear the Obama coalition is deeply broken. I wish it weren't so, but be open to the ways that we need to bring a deeper, even more diverse coalition to co-create the world that we dream about. Number 8, get real about power. I think this looks at things like, if you want to go to the People's March in Washington on January 18th, it's 2 days before the inauguration. Like I needed to go to the Women's March, and I took 5 buses of my closest friends to that Women's March because I needed that for me. I needed that for my soul and my spirit. And if that feels like the case, if that might help with the People's March, but I want us to be honest about getting real about power. We had this tremendous Women's March, and Trump doesn't care. We have to be real about, are we gathering with like-minded people for our own, mental health? And that's a good thing to do, but don't confuse that with nonviolent activism that's actually interrupting the powers that be as they currently are. So I want to give you just one quote about that I don't know of anyone who's written better about this than Gene Sharp. Here's one quote from him. By themselves, rulers cannot collect taxes, enforce repressive laws and regulations, keep trains running on time, prepare national budgets, direct traffic, manage ports, print money, repair roads, keep markets supplied with food, make steel, build rockets, train the police and army, issue postage stamps, or even milk a cow. People provide these services for the ruler through a variety of organizations and institutions. If people would stop providing these skills, the ruler could not rule. And that's the sort of thing that a general strike, that nonviolent, that's what it looks like. These are some of the thoughts of we'll see where we go from here. Number 9, handle fear and make violence rebound. This is another call to practice the tools of nonviolent activism, what we saw in the civil rights movement, that nonviolent activism's greatest effectiveness can be when authority figures overreach in their unjust prosecution of those who do not deserve it, and those who are given the orders to prosecute them don't obey. They lose the hearts and minds of those who had previously been willing to follow. And finally, number 10, envision a positive future. Read some Afrofuturism. There's some great, Octavia Butler and others. As the writer Waldita Emeritia says, the goal of a visionary future is to change the world. And I promise you this, one way or another, Trump will not be president forever. Change will come. The future is actually deeply uncertain. I don't want us to miss that. I sometimes use the examples of, terrible harm was done, but when you look at, if you roll your mind back 100 years and think of the history of Germany and Japan, look where those countries went through terrible things, and look, like Angela Merkel. How long was she Chancellor of Germany? Otto, what's his name, is Chancellor now. I can never remember him. I can only remember Angela. But as Jon Stewart challenged us to confront on his election night special, it is often easy to overinterpret election results. After Obama was elected, many people celebrated that we had entered a post-racial America. I wish it were so. Stewart says, yeah, that lasted a day. Instead, these things tend to result in pendulum swings and eventually in backlashes. Similarly, Republicans were told in the wake of Romney's defeat in 2012, they had no choice but to become more inclusive around immigration justice to win over Latino voters. Trump did exactly the opposite and won twice. Ultimately, all I can say for sure is that I am in it for the long haul to build the better world that we dream about, that we deserve, that our children and grandchildren deserve, and to do all I can in the next 4 years to do harm reduction. The hard truth is that we are a nation that has now twice elected Donald Trump. We are also a nation that twice elected a black man named Barack Hussein Obama. This election is forcing us to confront difficult truths about who we are as a country, but it is not the only story of who we are or who we may yet become. We remain the country of Thoreau, of Susan B. Anthony, of Eugene Debs, of Rosa Parks, and of James Baldwin, and so many other brave and courageous human ancestors and activists. And if we seemingly must be on this journey in this particular timeline. I am grateful to be on that journey with all of you. Please rise in body or spirit. Thank you. So as we prepare to go into the rest of this day, into the weeks, months, years to come, may you continue your journey with love. Changing what we can, right? Continue your journey with love. Care for one another. Care for this one earth. Do justice and make peace. And as you go, whatever taste or touch, even just a little bit, if you felt even just a little bit of hope or love or peace or joy in this time, that goes with you into the world. I'll share with you just one final quote from Sarah Kendzior. I shared this at our vigil. She said, I actually don't believe in hope, but I don't believe in hopelessness either. I believe in compassion. I believe in pragmatism, what works, and I believe in doing what is right for its own sake. Those three things can get us a long way in the next 4 years. Compassion and pragmatism and doing what is right for its own sake. So if any of this has touched you, the music, the words, that goes with you into the world. We're different for having spent this time together. May you live boldly. May you live with thanksgiving.